The millionaire's autistic son felt excluded and sad because he couldn't make any friends, which made the millionaire feel guilty about his son's situation. Until one day he came home early from work, and his heart stopped when he saw what his new babysitter and his son were doing. The rain fell in thick sheets over Manhattan, turning the panoramic view from Ethan Stone's high-rise apartment into a blurred gray watercolor. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the quiet fury of the ocean, but inside that fortress of glass and steel, the only sound was the discreet hum of the air conditioning. Ethan, a man whose fortune was built on the speed of data and the volatility of cryptocurrencies, felt the silence as a physical weight. It was the kind of silence money buys, but which now only seemed to amplify the void. He adjusted his wristwatch, a piece of Swiss engineering worth more than a luxury car, and his gaze fell upon the boy curled up beside him on the white leather sofa. Leo, his 7-year-old son, looked like an island in the vastness of the room. His eyes were fixed on a small plastic stegosaurus, his fingers tracing the bony plates on the toy's back with a concentration that isolated him from everything else. Ethan sighed. Every caregiving agency he hired sent candidates with impeccable resumes, but none of them could breach the invisible walls surrounding his son. They were competent professionals for managing an estate, but not for deciphering a soul. The doorbell rang, a soft velvet chime that barely disturbed the quiet. It was the 12th interview in 8 weeks. Ethan walked to the door, his posture flawless, his Italian linen suit without a single crease. On the other side, a young woman of simple appearance, her hair damp from the rain and a cloth tote bag hanging from her shoulder, looked down at her own feet, as if the polished Carrara marble of the hallway intimidated her. She introduced herself as Clara Hayes, her voice so low it was almost swallowed by the distant sound of the city traffic. Her clothes were modest but clean, and she carried with her the gentle scent of wet earth and hope. Ethan led her into the living room, maintaining a professional distance. He had no expectations left. He just needed someone to fill the hours while he multiplied his capital in global conferences and teleconferences. He noticed that upon entering, Clara's first glance was not for the surrounding opulence, nor for the multimillionaire evaluating her. It was for Leo, a long, curious, and genuinely interested look that made the boy, for a microsecond, lift his head from his dinosaur. The interview was brief and procedural. Ethan spoke about hours, responsibilities, and the need for absolute discretion. Clara listened, nodding, but her eyes kept searching for the small figure on the sofa. When Ethan finished, a silence settled. He expected her to hand over a resume or letters of recommendation. Instead, she opened her cloth bag and pulled out a spiral notebook, its cover a bit worn. "I don't have much formal registered experience," she said, her voice still wavering, but with a new timbre of firmness. "But I brought this." She opened the notebook on the glass coffee table. The pages didn't contain lines of text, but collages, drawings, and textures. There was a visual schedule with dinosaur figures to mark activities, a sensory map with different fabrics to touch, and a series of hand-drawn games with simple rules to help name emotions. "I know he likes dinosaurs," she murmured, more to herself than to Ethan. "I thought maybe we could start there, creating a safe world for him to explore before trying to enter ours." Ethan remained silent. He, who traded assets and analyzed complex fund returns, was looking at something whose value couldn't be measured in dollars or euros. On that rainy morning, amidst his immense wealth, a simple, handmade notebook seemed like the only investment that truly mattered. He looked from those colorful pages to the young woman's face and, for the first time, felt a spark of something that was neither profit nor interest, but a fragile and frightening possibility of change. Clara's first day was an anomaly in Ethan's routine. He spent the morning in his corner office, a sanctuary of technology and power with a view of the Hudson River skyline, where the stock market's fluctuation and the rise and fall of cryptocurrencies were the rhythm that dictated his life. He closed a multi-million-dollar deal before lunch, a strategic move that would significantly boost his shareholders' profits. But his mind kept wandering to the silent apartment he had left behind. The image of that simple, handmade notebook contrasted brutally with the spreadsheets of profitability and capital projection graphs dominating his screens. He felt skeptical. It was just another attempt, a short-term investment with a high probability of failure. Guilt, his old companion, whispered that he was outsourcing, yet again, the responsibility that was his. A meeting was cancelled at the last minute, opening an unexpected window in his afternoon. His instinct, sharpened by years of decisions involving huge sums of money, told him to use that time to analyze new assets, perhaps buy more gold as a hedge against market instability. But a different, softer, unknown impulse made him stand up, grab his leather briefcase, and go home. As he turned the key in the electronic lock, the first thing he noticed was the absence of the oppressive silence. In its place, there was a sound he took a moment to identify, a forgotten melody that made his heart stumble. It was laughter, electric, lively laughter that echoed down the marble hall. And the main voice, unmistakable, was Leo's. Ethan stopped, his body tense, as if he had heard a security alarm. He walked slowly, silently, following the sound to the entrance of the living room. And then he saw it. The scene unfolding before him was as unlikely as finding a system failure in his most secure software. Leo was sitting on the sofa, his eyes shining, holding a video game controller with a dexterity Ethan had never seen. Beside him, Clara narrated a car race on the screen with the excitement of a radio announcer. And he takes the tight corner. The dinosaur driver swerves past the lava obstacle, accelerating down the final straight. Can he make it? Can he make it? The atmosphere of the room was transformed. The LED lights, usually stark white and cold, were adjusted to a softer amber tone. A soft blanket covered Leo's legs, and on the coffee table, next to a glass of water, was Clara's notebook, open to a page that functioned as a visual schedule, a drawing of a video game controller, followed by an hourglass indicating a pause, a glass of water, and a figure of a child taking a deep breath. Ethan remained hidden, watching. He saw his son, who rarely made eye contact and flinched at touch, reach out and lightly touch Clara's arm when the game ended, and then he heard the two words that broke the dam of his emotional reserve. In a clear voice, one he almost didn't recognize because of how rarely he used it, Leo said, "Again." In that instant, Ethan's vast net worth, his assets, his dollars, and his investments seemed like dust. The pure joy in that request was worth more than his entire fortune. The house, which for so long had been merely a luxurious address, an asset in his real estate portfolio, suddenly remembered what it meant to be a home. A wave of relief and hope flooded him, but it was followed by a sharp pang of pain. The pain of having been absent, of having missed so many moments like this one. As he processed this avalanche of feelings, his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, the screen's brightness blinding him for a moment. It was a message from Leo's school coordinator, Ms. Albright, a rigid woman and a staunch defender of traditional methods. The message was short and chilling. "Mr. Stone, we need to speak urgently. I have serious concerns regarding the new caregiver's approach to Leo. I saw something at the gate today that I consider inappropriate and potentially harmful." The coordinator's message glowed on the phone screen, a cold patch of light that extinguished the newfound warmth in Ethan's chest. Harmful, inappropriate. The words were like stones thrown against the fragile greenhouse of joy he had just witnessed. His first instinct, forged in boardrooms where multi-million-dollar decisions were made in seconds, was to act, to call, demand an explanation, use the weight of his influence and his wealth to crush the accusation. But then, the sound of Leo's laughter, still echoing in his memory, stopped him. For the first time in a long time, the ruthless logic of his business seemed like an inadequate tool. This wasn't a problem of cash flow or stock profitability. It was about his son's happiness. He put the phone back in his pocket, the decision made in silence. He would not act, not yet. He would observe. He would give Clara the chance to prove that her method, however unorthodox it seemed, had value. He would treat this like a new investment, one with high risk, but whose potential profit was immeasurable. In the days that followed, life in the luxury apartment was subtly reprogrammed. The brushed steel refrigerator, once a cold monolith, now displayed a row of colorful pictograms outlining Leo's routine: wake up, eat, play, park, bath, sleep. Clara introduced the Yes and No workshop, a game with simple cards that taught Leo to express his boundaries safely. Ethan, at first, watched from afar, skeptical. It seemed too simplistic, almost childish, to solve such a complex puzzle. But his resistance began to crumble when, one morning, he saw Leo, who always passively accepted the orange juice, hold up the red card with the word no when the drink was offered. He didn't throw a fit, he didn't flinch. He just held up the card, his eyes steady. Clara smiled and said, "That's okay, Leo. Thank you for telling me. How about water?" And the boy nodded. That small act of autonomy was an emotional dividend Ethan hadn't expected to collect so soon. The video game, previously a source of concern, became the bridge. Clara used it as leverage. 30 minutes of dinosaur racing after we try the swings at the park for 5 minutes. Deal. And Leo, for the first time, negotiated. The forced proximity between Ethan and Clara began to weave its own silent thread. The conversations, who were previously strictly professional, was deepened. One evening, while preparing a snack for Leo in the spacious kitchen, their hands brushed as they reached for the same cabinet. A brief, electric touch that made both of them pull back, a blush rising on her face and a strange perturbation in his heart. He caught himself observing her, the way her lips moved when she read a story to Leo, the infinite patience in her voice. The way her gaze seemed to see beyond the surface of things. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or the assets surrounding him. She connected with the fragile humanity he tried to hide. She was calming the storms within Leo, but also, unknowingly, soothing the turbulent sea within him. Encouraged by his son's progress, Ethan finally decided it was time to confront the school. He would not allow the ignorance of an overzealous coordinator to destroy that seed of hope. He scheduled a meeting, preparing for a difficult but necessary conversation. He was willing to defend Clara's method, to explain the results he saw with his own eyes. The next day, he walked into the elite private school, a place that charged exorbitant tuition and promised the best for its students. He felt confident, armed with the evidence of his son's happiness. He knocked on the coordinator's office door and walked in, the polished speech on the tip of his tongue. But the words died before they were born. Sitting in a leather armchair beside Mrs. Albright's desk, with a calculated smile on his face, was the last person he expected to find there. His image consultant, Julian Cole. The air in the coordinator's office became dense and rarefied, like the thin air at the top of a skyscraper. Julian's presence there was as great an anomaly as a tech stock crashing on a market-high day. Julian was his strategist, the architect who shaped his public image, transforming the man Ethan into the visionary billionaire gracing the covers of business magazines. His specialty was managing intangible assets: reputation, trust, market perception. What was he doing in a meeting about a nanny's methodology? Julian. The word left Ethan's mouth as both a question and an accusation. The image consultant rose, the polished smile he used to calm nervous investors firmly in place. "Ethan, glad you could make it. Mrs. Albright reached out to me, concerned, and since your family's reputation is ultimately a direct reflection of yours, I thought it prudent to intervene. Intervene. The word sounded like a violation. Ms. Albright, the coordinator, cleared her throat, taking control. Mr. Stone, as I said, what I saw was inappropriate. The new employee was at the gate, kneeling at Leo's level, holding both his hands and talking very close to his face. Other parents saw it. This excessive proximity can confuse the child and, frankly, is unprofessional. Ethan felt a surge of fury. She was calming my son. He was anxious about the noise from the other students. For the first time in months, he walked into school without crying. I understand your emotional perspective, Julian interjected, his voice smooth and treacherous. But we need to consider the big picture. Your image is your most valuable asset. Associating it with amateur methods, with someone lacking formal credentials, that generates noise. The market hates noise. Stories start circulating. The tech genius can't manage his own house. Domestic issues affecting business focus. These are small liabilities that, when added up, can erode investor confidence. He spoke as if Leo's life were just another variable in a risk equation. Ms. Albright seized the moment. Exactly. The school values validated pedagogical protocols. Games are for recess. They're not therapy. This approach from your nanny disqualifies the serious work we do here. The contempt in the word nanny was palpable. Ethan felt the ground give way beneath his feet. He was being attacked on two fronts. With the same cold logic he himself used to manage his empire, they were turning Leo's progress into a public relations problem. Leo is talking more, he's laughing. Doesn't that count? He retorted, his voice strained with a frustration he rarely showed. Of course it counts to you, Julian said, condescendingly, but to your company's board, to the funds considering injecting capital into your next investment round. What counts to them is stability, predictability, and speaking of which, he picked up the tablet on the table. Mr. Petrov called from Singapore. He is demanding you take over negotiations personally. The trip is in 2 weeks. He insinuated that your domestic issues are undermining your performance. This is serious, Ethan. We're talking about an investment that could define the company's future. The trap was set. On one side, his son's fragile happiness. On the other, the future of his business, the maintenance of his fortune. The two things, which he had always believed could coexist, were now presented as mutually exclusive. He left that room feeling hollowed out, as if he had lost millions on the stock market. The confidence with which he had entered had dissipated. On the way home, the NYC rush hour traffic was a blur of lights and sound. He thought about the conversation, the corporate jargon used to dismantle something so pure. When he opened the apartment door, a silence greeted him, but it was a different silence, a soft silence of peace. In the living room, the amber light created a refuge. Leo and Clara were sitting on the plush rug, surrounded by a herd of plastic dinosaurs. They had built a miniature Jurassic Park. Leo picked up a triceratops and, in a clear, excited voice, explained, "This one has 3 horns to defend itself, and the Styracosaurus has many small horns. They are different." Clara listened with total attention, her face illuminated by a genuine smile. Then she looked up and saw Ethan standing at the entrance to the room, the storm visible on his face. Her smile faded, replaced by an expression of concern. "Is something wrong, Ethan?" Clara's question hung in the air, simple and direct, disarming the complexity of the battle Ethan had just fought. He looked at her face, a face that hid no calculations or ulterior motives, and the wall he built around himself began to crack. "Problems," he replied, his voice rougher than intended. "The school and my work. They don't understand." It wasn't a complete explanation, but it was the most vulnerability he allowed himself. Clara didn't press him. Her gaze dropped to Leo. who was now lining up the dinosaurs in a perfect row, creating a plastic barrier between them and the tension that had suddenly filled the room. She understood that the conversation could not continue there. Later, after Leo had fallen asleep, the plush T-Rex held firmly in his embrace. Clara found Ethan on the balcony. He was looking out at the illuminated city, an empire of lights at his feet, but his expression was that of a king besieged in his own castle. "They think I'm the problem, don't they?" she asked, her voice soft as the sea breeze. "They think I'm unqualified." Ethan turned to her, surprised by her perception. They used other words, amateur methods, inappropriate proximity. "My image consultant thinks you are a risk to my business." The confession came out bitter, as if he were betraying an ally. Clara absorbed the information in silence, her eyes fixed on the horizon. He expected to see hurt, anger, perhaps even tears, but instead, he saw a familiar resignation in her eyes, the shadow of an old wound. "It's not the first time I've heard that," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "People like me, we don't belong in places like this. There's always a wall, a rule, a protocol we don't know." The phrase hit him hard. He, who prided himself on his meritocracy, on having built his wealth from scratch, recognized the arrogance in his own journey. He never had to prove he belonged. His dollar bank account did that for him. "That's not fair," he said, his voice firm. "What you do with Leo is more valuable than any protocol." "Value isn't the same as price, Ethan," she replied, with a wisdom that didn't come from finance books. "To them, I'm a liability on your balance sheet, something that could generate a loss, and they will try to cut me." She hugged herself, a gesture of self-protection. Her vulnerability completely disarmed him. He took a step forward, the impulse to protect her almost irresistible, but he restrained himself. What could he offer? Money. That would only confirm their narrative. What she needed was something he rarely gave: trust. "I won't let them," he said, and the words sounded like an oath. "We will show them. We will prove them wrong." A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but it was quickly overshadowed by doubt. It was his word, a billionaire accustomed to winning, against a system designed to exclude her. The following Sunday dawned sunny, a vibrant counterpoint to the week's tension. Clara suggested a trip to the local street fair in the park, an idea that made Ethan's stomach clench. Crowds, noise, smells. It was a sensory minefield for Leo, but she had a plan, as always. Equipped with his noise-reducing headphones and a card that read, "I need space," Leo agreed. At the fair, the explosion of colors and sounds was overwhelming. Ethan remained on high alert, ready for a strategic retreat. But Clara navigated the chaos with impressive calm, pointing out specific things, creating a focus bubble for Leo. Suddenly, the sound of an accordion stood out from the cacophony. A street band played lively Americana bluegrass, joyful and contagious. Leo stopped. He took off one of the headphones. His head began to bob to the rhythm of the music. A small, hesitant smile bloomed on his lips. He saw a group of children playing with wooden toys near the musician. Instead of retreating, as he always did, he took a step forward. He watched for a moment, then took his favorite dinosaur, the Stegosaurus, from his backpack and held it out toward a boy. And then the words came, a whole sentence, hesitant but enormous in its meaning. "I want to show him my favorite dinosaur." Ethan, hidden behind his dark glasses, felt hot tears roll down his face. It was a victory, a spectacular victory, but on the other side of the circle of children, he saw a woman, one of the mothers from Leo's school, with her cell phone raised, the camera pointed directly at them, a malicious smile on her face. Ethan's joy was a sandcastle, built in a moment of sunshine and undone by the first wave. The malicious smile of that woman, the cell phone camera like a weapon, transformed the miracle he had witnessed into a piece of evidence. His son's vulnerability, the purity of that moment, was being hijacked, turned into content. He felt the familiar ice of anger grip his chest, the same cold, controlled fury he used to annihilate competitors in the business world. He quickly guided Leo and Clara away from the fair, the excuse of getting ice cream at home barely disguising the urgency in his voice. The rest of the day passed in a fog of apprehension. Ethan answered emails about the cash flow of a new project, but his mind was elsewhere, obsessively refreshing his phone screen, waiting for the blow he knew was coming. And it came. That evening, a notification from the school parents group chat flashed, discreet and lethal. The post was a photo taken from afar, grainy, showing Clara crouched down, holding Leo's hand. The caption, written by that mother, was sweet poison, excessive attachment, or something more. Leo's new nanny seems to want to take a place that isn't hers. For a family with their kind of net worth, too much caution is never enough. Within minutes, the stream of comments began. Phrases like, "I also thought she was too intimate. Professionalism is everything, right? Maybe he needs a real therapist, not a friend." Every word was a small shovelful of dirt thrown over the joy of that day. They were dissecting his life, his son's, and Clara's. With the casual cruelty of someone commenting on the weather, Ethan's rage boiled, transforming into an overwhelming desire to retaliate. He could activate his lawyers, expose that woman, use his capital to make her regret it. But Julian's voice echoed in his mind. Small liabilities that erode confidence. A public fight was exactly the kind of noise his investors and board hated. He was cornered, a powerful billionaire, yet impotent to protect the dignity of those under his roof. Clara sensed the change in the atmosphere, as if the air had grown heavy. The next morning, at the school gate, the smiles she received were cold. The good mornings whispered. She saw the glances, the phones quickly put away when she approached. The ghost of rejection, which she had fought so hard to keep dormant, awoke with a voracious hunger. She didn't need to read the messages to know she was the center of a storm. She was the piece that didn't fit, the dissonant note in the symphony of that elite. The joy she had felt watching Leo connect with the world was replaced by a dull ache. She was becoming a problem, a burden on the family that had welcomed her. Her presence, instead of helping, was attracting negative attention, exactly what Ethan, with his public life, did not need. That night, while folding Leo's clothes, her chest tight with anguish, she made a decision. It seemed like the only right decision. She would leave. She would slip away quietly to protect them from shame, to restore peace to that house. It would be better for Leo, better for Ethan. She was just the nanny replaceable. With a heavy heart, she went to her room and picked up the small cloth bag. She didn't have much to take. As she emptied it to pack her few belongings, a crumpled piece of paper fell to the floor. It was a drawing, made with crayon on a sheet from the activity notebook. She unfolded it. There were 3 stick figures, clumsy and childlike, holding hands. A tall man, a small boy, and a woman with curly hair. Above them, a red heart drawn with force, and underneath, in crooked, hesitant letters, 2 phrases that sucked all the air from her lungs: "You make me happy." And, right below, "Mommy." The word "mommy," drawn with the clumsy force of a child's hand, was both an anchor and an anvil. Clara folded the paper with almost reverent care and placed it against her chest. Like a precious and dangerous secret, the idea of leaving dissolved, replaced by a painful determination. She couldn't abandon Leo, not now that he had given a name to what they felt. But the word also confirmed the fear that haunted her. She was occupying a space that wasn't hers, blurring lines that should be sharp. The malicious rumor of the other mothers gained, in her own eyes, a veneer of truth. She didn't want to usurp any place. This calling, which dismantled her, also forced her to be even more invisible, to place herself even further in the background, to be the impeccable professional no one could accuse of anything. It was a silent pact she made with herself, a new defense mechanism to protect everyone's heart, including her own. The second week concluded with the dress rehearsal for the school's annual spring fair, an event that, for most children, was synonymous with joy, but which for Leo was a sensory battlefield. The covered patio was decorated with aggressive colored streamers swinging under the ceiling fans. The sound of the carnival music, loud and distorted by the cheap PA system, ricocheted off the walls. The smell of popcorn and hot dogs mixed with the strong perfume of the other mothers, creating a suffocating haze. Clara tried to create a bubble for Leo, using the headphones and showing him a card with the sequence of events. But it was useless. The chaos was total. Children ran and screamed, pushing in line for the carnival games. A teacher popped a paper bag to simulate a firecracker, and the dry, unexpected sound was the trigger. Leo flinched, his hands crushing his ears hard, his body starting to tremble. His eyes, previously focused and curious, were lost in a fog of panic. He let out a low, sharp moan, the sound of a cornered animal. He collapsed. Clara wrapped him in her arms, trying to shield him from the avalanche of stimuli, whispering calming words that were swallowed by the noise. That's when Ms. Albright appeared beside them, her face a mask of triumph and disapproval. "I warned you," she said, her voice loud enough for other parents to hear. "This is the result of overprotection. He's not prepared for the real world because you isolate him with those little games and gadgets." At that exact instant, Ethan's cell phone, which had arrived moments before to pick up his son, vibrated insistently in his pocket like a fire alarm. It was the international call from Singapore, Mr. Petrov. The investor's voice was sharp as broken glass. "Ethan, the last quarter's reports are disappointing. The profitability of our applications is below expectations. The market is nervous, and my partners question whether you still have focus. Your personal issues are affecting the business. I need you here, now. My capital cannot be left at the mercy of your domestic instability." The pressure crushed Ethan. On one side, his son in visible distress. On the other, the veiled threat of losing an investment that could seal the future of his company, his fortune. He looked at Clara, who stared at him with pleading eyes, expecting defense, support, a wall against the coordinator's attack. He saw her pain, Leo's helplessness, the curious glances all around, and in an act of cowardice that would haunt him for a long time, he chose the path of least resistance. He approached her, and in the low, icy voice of a CEO giving an order, he committed his hardest mistake. "I require maximum discretion. Do not confront the school. Just calm him down and let's go home." The words hit her like a slap. Clara felt something break inside her, the small flame of hope he had ignited, the feeling that perhaps, for the first time, she belonged somewhere, suddenly went out, leaving only ashes and a cutting cold. The drive back home was a silent journey through devastated territory. The interior of the luxury car, normally a cocoon of comfort, became a vacuum chamber where unspoken emotions suffocated the air. Leo, huddled in his car seat, stared fixedly out the window, but his eyes didn't register the passing landscape. He had retreated into himself, a safe place where loud sounds and harsh words couldn't reach him. Clara sat in the passenger seat, her posture rigid, her hands crossed in her lap. Her eyes, which once shone with empathy and creativity, were dull, as if an internal curtain had been closed. She was the image of wounded professionalism, a statue of resignation. Ethan drove, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel. Every red light was torture, forcing him to confront the reflection of his failure in the rearview mirror, his son's pale face, the tense nape of the woman he had betrayed with his silence and his cowardly order. The fortune he managed with such precision seemed like a bad joke. He was a genius at managing financial assets and liabilities, but utterly inept at the emotional balance sheet of his own home. In the days that followed, the apartment, which had begun to breathe and have a pulse, returned to being a mausoleum. The aroma of freshly baked cookies and warm coffee cake was replaced by the chemical and sterile scent of cleaning products. The amber lights, which created a cozy atmosphere, were readjusted to the cold, corporate white of before. Leo's electric laughter was replaced by the omnipresent hum of the air conditioning. Clara became the perfect employee. She arrived punctually, fulfilled the visual schedule with robotic efficiency, and left without a minute of delay. Her voice was polite, her actions impeccable, but the soul of her work had vanished. She no longer proposed games, no longer invented stories. The yes and no workshop was abandoned. She meticulously cared for Leo's physical needs, but the magical connection that united them had been broken. She avoided Ethan's gaze, answering his questions with short, objective phrases, creating an invisible but impenetrable barrier between them. Leo, like a sensitive seismograph, registered the emotional earthquake and regressed. The video game, which had become a tool for negotiation and shared joy, returned to being a solitary refuge. He played in silence, his shoulders hunched, isolated in a digital world. The herd of dinosaurs no longer formed Jurassic Parks on the living room rug. Now they were lined up in rigid, obsessive rows, a clear reflection of his need for order amidst the internal chaos. The progress that seemed so solid dissolved like smoke. The cold was back, and with it, Ethan's deepest fear, the fear of losing everything again, not his money, not his business, but the soul of his house, the light in his son's eyes. Guilt corroded him. He tried to apologize one night in the kitchen. "Clara, about what happened at school. She turned, her face expressionless. "You don't need to explain yourself, Mr. Stone. I am your employee. I will comply with your orders." The Mr. Stone was like a punch. She had never called him that before. He was the boss, she the employee. The line they had blurred with glances and crossing hands had been redrawn with permanent ink. That night, locked in his office, surrounded by screens showing the health of his net worth, he felt like the poorest man in the world. His gaze fell upon Leo's notebook, which was on his desk. He opened it and saw a page he hadn't noticed before. It was a drawing of a large dinosaur protecting a small one, with a circle around them. Outside the circle, several other dinosaurs, with pointed teeth, tried to approach. Underneath the drawing, with Clara's help, he had written, "My daddy protects me." Ethan felt the weight of those words as a condemnation. He had failed in his only truly important business. The fourth week began under the weight of an armed peace. The routine, once a flexible skeleton that Clara dressed with creativity and affection, became a rigid armor. Breakfast was a silent ballet of shared loneliness. Ethan read financial market news on his tablet, the rise and fall of stocks, a cold substitute for conversation. Clara, sitting at the other end of the glass table, checked bus schedules on her cell phone, already planning her departure before the day even began. And Leo, between the two of them, pushed food from one side of his plate to the other, a small satellite caught in the orbit of two extinguished suns. Ethan's net worth grew every hour, with compound interest and high-yield investments, but in his own home, the emotional capital was bankrupt. He knew he had to do something, that an apology wouldn't be enough. Words had become a minefield. He needed action. One afternoon, driven by a painful nostalgia for that magical first day, he found the video game controller on the shelf, covered with a fine layer of dust. A desperate idea sprouted in his mind. Maybe he could recreate the moment, prove that he too could be that bridge to Leo's world. He sat on the sofa, his heart beating with an anxiety he didn't feel even when closing nine-figure deals. "Leo!" he called, his voice sounding strange and formal in the silent room. "How about a race? Like before?" The boy looked up from his army of lined-up dinosaurs and looked at his father, then at the controller. a spark of interest in his eye. Ethan felt a drop of hope. He turned on the TV and the console, but immediately erred. The volume, which Clara always kept low, exploded into the room. The screen, with the brightness maximized, was an aggression of light and color. Leo flinched, clamping his hands over his ears. Ethan, flustered, lowered the sound and brightness, but the charm was already broken. He tried to narrate the game, mimic Clara's excitement, but his voice came out forced, a poor echo of the original. He didn't know the names of the dinosaur cars, didn't understand the secret rules Leo and Clara had created. After 2 clumsy turns, Leo dropped the controller on the sofa, got up without a word, and returned to his rug, where he began methodically realigning his toys. The rejection was silent, absolute, and devastating. From the kitchen doorway, Clara observed the scene, her heart tight with a mixture of pity and pain. The instinct to run over there, to grab the controller and show Ethan how it was done, to whisper to Leo that it was okay, was almost unbearable. But his words echoed in her mind like a cold mantra. Maximum discretion. Do not confront. She had been put in her place, and her place was that of someone who doesn't interfere. Intervening now would be to challenge his order. It would be to prove Ms. Albright right. She cared too much. So she turned and opened the faucet. The sound of the water, a white noise to drown out the anguish of her impotence. She washed a cup that was already clean, focusing on the mundane task to keep from collapsing. Ethan was left alone in the living room, the video game controller in his hand, seeming like an artifact from a lost civilization. The menu music of the game, cheerful and repetitive, was cruel mockery. In that moment of absolute failure, his cell phone rang. Julian's name flashed on the screen. He answered, expecting another crisis report. The consultant's voice was urgent, without the usual pleasantries. Ethan, Petrov's patience is gone. He scheduled the final meeting in Singapore for next week. Either you get on that plane and save the biggest investment in company history, or you can start calculating the size of your loss. And he sent one final message. He said he doesn't negotiate with men who can't keep their own house in order. Julian's voice dissipated, but his words solidified in the air. An ultimatum that weighed more than all the gold stored in the vaults that secured his net worth. Singapore, the deal of a lifetime, the kind of agreement that turned multi-millionaires into billionaires, that guaranteed an inheritance for generations. It was a global-scale chess move involving monumental cash flow, and he was the king who needed to move to avoid checkmate. He walked to the glass wall of his office, the nighttime NYC at his feet, a galaxy of opportunities and wealth. On his screens, charts blinked in green and red, the incessant pulse of the stock market, the ebb and flow of dollars, euros, and cryptocurrencies that constituted his empire. This was his world, a world of logic, calculated risk, and profitability, a world he dominated. But his gaze crossed the glass and landed on the silent figure of his son in the living room. Leo was not an asset. His suffering was not a liability that could be amortized. It was a debt that grew at exorbitant interest rates, and Ethan felt he was about to become insolvent. The night dragged on, heavy and sleepless. The house was a labyrinth of hostile silences. Around 2 in the morning, unable to find peace, Ethan got up. The trip to Singapore would require planning, mobilizing his team, a total immersion in the numbers. But he couldn't concentrate. An invisible force guided him to Leo's small school backpack, left beside the sofa. He opened it with a care he didn't dedicate to his most confidential reports. He pulled out the worn-cover notebook, the same one Clara had brought on the first day. That artifact of a time that now seemed to belong to another life. He sat at the coffee table, the only light coming from the distant city glow. The first pages were vibrant, full of colorful dinosaurs and cheerful schedules. As he progressed, the colors faded. The drawings became sparser, the lines more rigid. It was a visual diary of his son's recession of joy. Then he came to one of the last pages. There were no drawings, just one word, repeated several times, in Leo's shaky, strained handwriting, like macabre homework. Turtle. Ethan frowned. Turtle? Why would he write that so many times? The word itself didn't seem offensive. Perhaps it was a new interest. But something in the obsessive repetition, in the force with which the pencil had been pressed against the paper, disturbed him. He grabbed his phone and, with a terrible premonition, typed the word into a search engine, adding schoolyard slang. The result hit him like a punch to the gut. It was a derogatory nickname, a cruel insult used to mock children considered slow, who took time to respond, who lived at their own pace. Children like Leo. The air escaped his lungs. The fever, the anxiety at school, the collapse at the spring fair, the regression to silence. It wasn't just sensory overload. It was an attack, slow, continuous, and cruel. He, the man who predicted market fluctuations, who built a fortune by anticipating movements, hadn't seen the daily suffering happening right under his nose. Crushed by guilt, he was about to close the notebook when something else caught his attention. In the lower corner of the page, almost erased, but still legible in the faint light, was a note in Clara's elegant handwriting. It was 4 words that turned his guilt into icy horror. 4 words that proved she knew everything long before he did. The note read, "This does not define you." The notebook remained open in his hands, a silent testament to his negligence. This does not define you. 4 words. A barricade of affection that Clara had built to protect his son, while he, the father, the man with a net worth capable of moving markets, worried about the opinion of investors and coordinators. The shame was a physical wave, hot and suffocating. He stood up, the notebook still in hand as if it were evidence of a crime, his crime, and went to the kitchen. Clara was turned away from him, washing the breakfast dishes with a methodical efficiency that was, in itself, a form of distance. The cold morning light entered through the window, outlining her rigid silhouette. He stopped at the doorway, his breath caught in his throat. Clara. His voice came out scraped, stripped of all its usual authority. She turned slowly, her eyes cautious, her expression neutral. He took a step forward and placed the open notebook on the granite counter, pointing to the page with the repeated word and her note. Turtle, he said, the name of the insult sounding obscene in his own mouth. You knew they were hurting him, and I told you to keep quiet. It wasn't a question, it was a confession. Clara's professionalism finally broke. Her shoulders slumped, and a deep pain, which she had held back for weeks, flooded her gaze. I couldn't tell you, she whispered. Her voice choked. You asked me for discretion. If I confronted the school, they would fire me. And Leo would be left with no one. If I told you, you would make a scene, and your consultant would call it more noise. I thought the only thing I could do was be with him. It was to strengthen him from the inside, so their words wouldn't break him. The tears she had refused to cry now streamed down her face, silent and bitter. They were tears of frustration, of helplessness, of fierce affection for that boy. Ethan felt the impact of that loyalty, of that emotional guerrilla strategy waged in the shadows. She hadn't disobeyed him. She had obeyed him in the only way her conscience allowed, protecting his most precious asset while he was busy protecting his capital. He walked around the counter and stopped in front of her, closer than he had been in weeks. The distance between them vibrated with regret and a fragile possibility of reconnection. I was a fool, he said, his voice low and raw. I confused the price of things with their value. Forgive me, please. The plea was not that of a boss, but of a broken man. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he didn't see the nanny, but the woman, the ally he had discarded. Tell me what to do. What are we going to do? The shift from I to we was the bridge she needed. Clara wiped her tears with the back of her hand, the warrior inside her rising from the ashes. "We can't hide anymore," she said, her voice gaining firmness. "We need a meeting with the school, but not just us. They will dismiss us. I know an excellent educational psychologist, Dr. Sophia. She works at the local community health center in my neighborhood. She specializes in conflict mediation and inclusion." Ethan stared at her. "The community health center. I sponsor that clinic. It's one of my social investments." The irony struck him. The money he anonymously set aside to clean his conscience was now the key to his son's salvation. "Exactly," Clara said. Her presence as a professional from a public institution prevents them from simply deferring or ignoring us. She has authority. We have to be ethical but firm. At that moment, Ethan's cell phone rang on the counter, Julian's name flashing on the screen. The Singapore call, the ultimatum. He looked at the device, then at Clara's determined face. The choice was clear, the only one that mattered. He rejected the call. The sound of the ensuing silence was a declaration of war. He picked up his own phone, found the school's number, and dialed. The secretary answered. "Please inform Mrs. Albright that I will be there tomorrow at 9 a.m. for a meeting. Myself, my son's caregiver, and an educational psychologist who will accompany us, and this is not a request." He hung up. The click of the phone echoed in the kitchen. The decision was made. The battle was about to begin. The coordinator's office, which had previously intimidated Ethan, now seemed small and inadequate. The air was charged with polished hostility. Ms. Albright sat behind her mahogany desk, a fortress of besieged authority. Beside her, with the expression of someone forced to participate in an unpleasant event, sat Julian Cole, the image consultant. Ethan had insisted he be present. He needed to witness the choice being made. On the other side of the table, they formed an unlikely but united bloc. Ethan, with a glacial calm that hid his fury. Clara, whose modest posture was supported by a new and unwavering firmness. And Dr. Sophia, the educational psychologist, a middle-aged woman with a keen gaze and a serenity that disarmed the environment's aggression. And Saul in the chair next to Clara, the central and most important piece of that meeting, Leo. He held a card that Clara had prepared the night before. On one side, a green signal with the phrase, "I can speak." On the other, a red signal, "I need a break." It was his shield and his voice. Miss Albright began, her voice sugary and defensive. "Mr. Stone, as I said, the school has protocols. We are very surprised by this approach, bringing in an external professional. Doctor, Sophia is here at my invitation to mediate." Ethan cut her off, his voice flat. "And we are here to talk about one word, turtle." The word fell onto the table like a stone. The coordinator paled slightly. "Bullying is a very serious accusation. Our students are instructed it's not an accusation, it's a fact," Clara said, her voice clear and unshaking. She opened Leo's notebook on the desk, showing the page with the repeated word, "And we didn't come here to point fingers, but to build a solution." Dr. Sophia took the floor, her presence bringing a weight of neutrality and expertise that the coordinator couldn't ignore. She explained the impact of derogatory nicknames on the development of children on the spectrum, the pain they caused, and the need for a direct, educational, not punitive, intervention. Julian shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. This conversation did not involve profit, dividends, or brand image. It was about humanity, ground he rarely trod upon. The crucial moment arrived. Dr. Sophia turned to Leo. "Leo, do you want to tell us how you feel when you hear that word?" The boy looked at Clara, who nodded with an encouraging smile. He squeezed the card in his hands, took a deep breath as they had practiced, and, for the first time, used his own voice in that hostile environment. He flipped the card to the green side. In a trembling, yet surprisingly audible voice, he said, "Everything gets loud inside my head, and my body gets hard, like a shell. That's why I turn into the turtle. The silence that followed was deep and heavy as a veil. The simple, devastating honesty of those words disarmed all corporate and pedagogical rhetoric. In that moment, Leo was not a student with special needs or a domestic problem. He was a child describing his pain. Miss Albright lowered her eyes, finally defeated by the truth. Julian looked at the floor, perhaps for the first time feeling the weight of the human consequences behind his image strategies. Some children, who had been called into the room for mediation, stirred restlessly. A girl, her eyes full of tears, whispered, "I'm sorry, Leo." Others looked away, guilt visible on their faces. It was a victory, fragile, painful, but a victory. They left the room with the promise of an action plan, of discussion groups, of sensory adjustments for the spring fair. But victories like this come with a price. When Ethan turned on his cell phone upon entering the car, messages exploded on the screen. One from his bank manager, in a panic, one from his lawyer, urgent, and one from Julian, who had gotten up and left the meeting as soon as it concluded. The message was short and final. Petrov has cancelled the investment round. He said, "A man who exposes his own family in this manner is not reliable." And Ethan, "I agree. Consider this my resignation. I cannot risk my reputation with your instability. You chose your side. Good luck." The blow was brutal, a potential loss of hundreds of millions of dollars, a hole in his net worth and his image. The ship he had built with such effort was being abandoned by his first mate. He looked at Clara, at Leo in the back seat, who held his stegosaurus with a new tranquility. He had won the battle, but the war for his fortune was just beginning. He felt as if he were in the middle of the ocean, in a life raft, having just set fire to his own ship. The phone's persistent ringing on the car dashboard was a sharp echo of the life Ethan had just imploded. Hundreds of millions of dollars evaporated, his professional reputation in tatters, his chief strategist abandoning him. Years ago, news like this would have thrown him into a hurricane of calls, orders, and damage control strategies to protect his net worth. He would have seen the cancellation of Petrov's investment as a catastrophic liability, but, looking in the rearview mirror, he didn't see the reflection of a defeated billionaire. He saw Leo, who for the first time in weeks was not hunched over, but sitting upright, gently running his fingers over the bony plates of his stegosaurus, his face serene. Beside him, Clara looked out the window, but her body was no longer tense. There was a relaxation in her shoulders, a lightness he hadn't seen since the day he had humiliated her. And Ethan understood. He had lost nothing of value. He had only gotten rid of dead weight. The true profit of that day couldn't be measured in dollars or euros. With a calm that surprised himself, he picked up the phone. He ignored the panicked calls and opened Julian's message. His response was short, without anger or resentment. "Understood. I wish you success in your future endeavors." He wasn't firing a consultant, he was divorcing a mindset. Next, he drafted a formal email to Mr. Petrov, copied to his company's board. "Dear Mr. Petrov, I appreciate your interest, but after careful re-evaluation, I have decided that your company's direction and values do not align with mine. My capital priority, at this time, is investing in people, not just projections. I formally withdraw my proposal." He hit send and felt an immense relief, as if he had sold off toxic stocks that were contaminating his entire portfolio. The next decision was even easier. He would not take Leo back to that battlefield disguised as an educational institution. The victory in the meeting didn't change the fact that the environment was hostile to his son's soul. That same afternoon, he and Clara visited the local public school in her neighborhood, the same one Dr. Sophia had recommended. It was a simple building, without the glass and steel facade of the other, but the walls were covered with colorful drawings and student projects. They were greeted by the principal in a sensory resource room, a space with beanbag chairs, different textures on the walls, and adjustable lighting. The pedagogical proposal was clear. Inclusion was not an appendix. It was the foundation. As the principal spoke, Ethan saw Leo, who had entered the room with hesitation, approach an activity panel and begin to explore it. Curious, the decision was made, faced with Ms. Albright's furious resistance, who accused him of undermining the reputation of her elite school. He simply signed the transfer papers. It was a move that would generate headlines, that would paint him as an eccentric. But he no longer cared what the world thought of his fortune. He cared about what his son thought of him. Ethan's transformation didn't stop there. He called an emergency meeting at his company. In front of perplexed executives, he announced the creation of a new department, an inclusion and training program for young adults on the autism spectrum, with guaranteed internship and employment opportunities. He would use the capital intended for Petrov's deal to fund the project. "Consider this our most important investment," he said, his voice resonating with an authority that came not from his net worth, but from his conviction. The profitability will be measured in transformed lives. News of his actions spread like wildfire. Headlines in business newspapers were cruel, predicting the decline of his empire. Critics called him unstable, emotional. But something unexpected happened. A wave of support began to emerge from where he least expected it. Emails and messages from other families, other parents of neurodivergent children who lived the same injustice in silence, thanking him for his courage. He had lost a billionaire investor, but he had gained a community. He had closed the doors to a predatory business world and opened a window to something real, something that money couldn't buy and the stock market couldn't crash. The 8th week arrived, not with the fury of a storm, but with the calm that follows it. Night was falling over Manhattan, an indigo velvet sprinkled with lights, and the salty breeze entering the open balcony no longer carried the scent of loneliness, but of rosemary and freshly baked cookies coming from the kitchen. The apartment, once a showcase of impersonal wealth, now had the warmth of a home. Leo arrived from the new school, his face illuminated by a tranquility Ethan hadn't seen in years. He recounted, in short, proud sentences about the quiet room he could use when the noise became too much, about the protective headphones no one thought strange, and about a classmate who had learned to use a combination of signs with him before suggesting a game. It was a day of successful integration, a dividend of peace harvested from the riskiest investment Ethan had ever made in his life. He looked at Clara, whose smile reflected his own, and knew that his net worth, the real one, was no longer stored in funds or accounted for in dollars, but was right there, in that room, breathing. After dinner, something changed in the family's silent dynamic. Leo, who usually retreated to his drawings, walked to the sofa and turned to both of them. "Come on," he said, his voice clear, an invitation, not a request. Ethan and Clara exchanged surprised glances and followed him. The boy picked up the video game controller, turned on the console and, with ceremonial seriousness, navigated to the player menu. He selected cooperative mode. A dinosaur driver avatar appeared. He added a second and then a third. He lined up the 3 avatars side by side on the screen. Before the race countdown began, he rested the controller on his lap, looked at Clara, and took a deep breath. Exactly as he had learned in the yes and no workshop, the air in the room hung suspended, charged with expectation. Then, in a firm voice, flexing the phrase he guarded like a treasure since the day he had drawn it, he said, "You make me happy, Mommy." The silence that followed was deeper than the ocean outside. It was a silence of awe, of healing, of something finally finding its place. The tears Clara had held back for so long came, but they were not tears of pain. They were of relief, of an emotion so overwhelming it couldn't fit in her chest. Ethan felt his own face dampen. the tears washing away the last traces of the man he had been. Leo, with the pure spontaneity of children, leaned forward and touched foreheads with Clara, a gesture of affection so simple and so profound that it sealed the truth of his words. Ethan looked at the woman who had taught him and his son the meaning of courage, the woman who had transformed his luxurious real estate asset into a home. He finally embraced the feeling that blossomed amid the chaos. "I can't promise you a fairy tale," he said, his voice choked, "but I can promise my presence. I want to walk alongside you slowly, at the pace Leo teaches us." The balcony filled with the smells of home cooking, and the video game, forgotten on the sofa, played the sound of victory. The city below pulsed, indifferent to the small revolution happening in that apartment. There would still be sideways glances and daily struggles, but the rules of the game were now clear. Respected routine, communicated choices, active listening, and a love built without spectacle. The romance was sealed there, not with a grand declaration, but with a shy, almost secret kiss after Leo, with a mischievous smile, picked up the controller and held it out to both of them. "Now," he announced, his face glowing with happiness, "we are three on the same team," and the audience, who held their breath through every injustice and cheered for every small victory, could finally take a deep breath, knowing that this happy ending was not a gift of fate, but a conquest that cost courage, renunciation, and the refusal to accept anything less than the truth of a home.